For once, I find myself almost speechless.
Amen.
I can't thank you enough for the time away with children, grandchildren, a spouse. Thank you so much. And it means the world to me, and it also is equally invigorating and a cause of great gratitude just to come back and be in this Christian family. Speaking of this Christian family, I noticed that while I was gone, there was an incredible country market that raised over $4,000 for those in need from this little parish Christian family. And there was a sort of a incredible chili cook-off and dinner. I looked in the refrigerator and I was surprised to see no leftovers for me. But about the only negative thing I can say about this experience that you granted to Linda and me is that during that 6 weeks period, the Green Bay Packers went 0-6. How could you let that happen? You ruined a perfectly wonderful sabbatical. It's wonderful to be back. It really is. The word parish family or Christian family can roll off the tongue pretty easily, but when you go away from a group and come back into it and embraced by it again, I'm reminded of what I'm sure you all know. And, speaking of what you all know, what I hope you know, I mentioned those two incredible events, the country market and the chili cook-off. That's just a message to all of us that the life, the energy, the creativity of the people of Christ Church, none of that is dependent upon any particular, clergy person. It wells up from you all. Congratulations on who you are. It's good to be back, embraced in the midst of this family. So, I'll just pose the question for the day. What time is it? What time is it? And I don't wear a watch, and I don't have my phone with me, so I can't really answer that question in a literal way. But it really doesn't matter, because the notion of what time it is carries with it a lot more ambiguity than you might think on the surface of things. When I first announced a long time ago that I was headed off to seminary and pursuing path toward ordination, people started coming to me with questions, theological, deep, meaningful questions. And one thing I found pretty early on is that the younger the questioner, typically, the more difficult the question. So it was one Christmas break from seminary. I'm at my parents' house back home in Kentucky, and my little 6-year-old niece, Katie, comes barreling toward me with just a fierce look in her eyes. And she runs up to me and she says, "Uncle Tom." "Yes, Katie?" "What is God's time?" And I knew better than to answer that question. But despite my better judgment, I went ahead and I said, "Katie, what do you mean? God's in all times. He's not limited." She said, "But you know what I mean. Is God on Central Time or Eastern Time?" And I said, "Katie, God is in all time. God's not limited by time. God's with you all the time." Katie looked at me and she said, "Ha! You work for the guy and you don't know what time he's on." There's a lot more ambiguity related to the issue of what time it is than you might think. You just that gospel reading that we have today, we're nearing the end of the liturgical year. The new year is beginning with the first Sunday in Advent, 2 weeks hence, and so the lectionary has us looking at such passages as this one. And you might think on the surface of things that Jesus is talking about the end of time. But scholars as eminent as N.T. Wright would hasten to add that, no, Jesus is not talking about the end of time as we sometimes think of the end of time, now. But look at what he's talking about. It's indicated right there in the first sentence or two of the passage. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "For all these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." Sometimes when you have a minute, pick up Mark's version of this event. It's Holy Week. Jesus and his disciples have gone into the temple, and then they've come out. And these people are all from Galilee. Do you know what I mean? Like country bumpkins down in the big city. And in Mark's gospel, it's made explicit. His disciples come out, and they're looking around like this, pretty much like I think Mark Heidloff was looking around in New York City last weekend when he was in New York from Charlottesville, just thinking about what it might be like to be city manager of New York City. And he's looking around, he's like, "Look at all them buildings and all them stones." Well, that's what these country bumpkins were doing. And Jesus said, as they're marveling at Solomon's incredible, majesty of the temple, he just says, "Yeah, take a look at those stones. Take a look at that incredible building. You know what? It's all gonna come down." So here's Jesus, roughly probably in the year 33 AD, and he's talking about something that's going to happen in the future. The gospel that records the account that we've just heard was probably not written for another 50 or so years, more than 50 years after that moment, after that day. So time just sort of gets slippery, even from the fact that it's not even, it's a 50-year-old event when it's first put down in writing, as it were. And something happened between that day with Jesus and his disciples and the writing down of the event as it's remembered by St. Luke the evangelist. And that something that occurred in the year 70 AD. And in the year 70 AD, the people of God, the Jewish people, rose up in rebellion against the Roman Empire, their persecutors and oppressors, their occupiers. And the Roman Empire sent in troops and quelled the rebellion and destroyed Solomon's temple. Hardly a stone was left standing on a stone. So, in fact, people say in the time of St. Luke the evangelist to the event from 33 AD that we have before us today, and they said, "This guy is onto something," And part of what this guy was onto was reality and honesty. As Jesus looked into the future, he saw things that were real, and he was honest enough to share them with his dear friends, the one whom he loved the most. He didn't try to sugarcoat reality or dance around on the surface of things in some kind of pie-in-the-sky, saccharine religiosity. He faced the human condition right at the depths of where it really is. Where, for instance, you and I, in our own way, from day to day, know how it is. Joys and sorrows, gains and losses, pain, suffering. And so it was that as he reflected with his disciples that day about what lay in the future in terms of the passage of time, he also added these words: "Before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you'll be brought before kings and governors because of my name." Now, if you want to get literal, and I hope you don't, probably not a single one of us in this sacred place today is ever going to be brought before kings and queens and, governors, or being imprisoned? Probably not, with one or two exceptions. But Jesus' point is that the future is filled with all sorts of ambiguous, sometimes threatening realities, my brothers and sisters, and I want to do what I can to get you ready for it. I don't want to pretend that everything is just absolutely always, happy days are here again. Tough times will come to all of God's children. And as he issues that acknowledgement, that reminder, did you notice what he said to his disciples in the midst of that? This will give you an opportunity to testify. All this that's coming your way, good and bad, all the reality of human existence that inevitably lies in front of you in the passage of the ambiguity of time, that is going to be for you an opportunity to testify. To point to hope in the midst of hopelessness. To embody being a beacon of hope and peace that passes human understanding in the midst of the realities that we know we all face. And a temptation that we all face is to think that in these passages that inevitably come the way of every child of God, that the time is never just quite right to do that. Things are just maybe a little too unsettled right now, conflicted right now, to be a witness of unity and love, peace, harmony, hope. C.S. Lewis gave a sermon back in 1942 in England. What were those rockets called? V-2 rockets? And the Luftwaffe bombers flying overhead in London and throughout southern England especially. He gave a sermon to students at Oxford University who were buffeted about, as was the rest of the British citizenry, with the question of whether they were going to even survive to the next day, much less continue on in their studies. So he stood up in church at Oxford University, Christ Church, and he spoke these words to these confused, bewildered, and frightened young people. The war creates no absolutely new situation. It simply aggravates the permanent human situation so that we can no longer ignore it. Human life has always been lived on the edge of a precipice. If people had postponed the search for knowledge and beauty and truth until they were secure, the search would have never begun. We are mistaken when we compare war with normal life. Life has never been normal. Life is always ambiguous. Life is always, in one way or another, frightful and foreboding. And it's in the midst of the reality of that life passage for each of us that Jesus tells us we're called on his behalf to testify, to be witnesses, to be beacons of hope, to offer solace to the disconsolate, and to cling in the midst of all that to Jesus and be instruments of a deep love and unity that's beyond what the world can understand. And the very best news of all in this gospel passage that we have probably is also the very best news of any of our lives, the best news that any of us could ever hope for. Jesus makes a promise in the midst of this troubling and bewildering passage in front of the temple that when we're seeking to respond to his call to testify, We don't have to come up with it on our own. He said to his disciples that day in Jerusalem what he says to us. Make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. I will give you words and wisdom and strength and purpose and courage and love to make the passage. Don't worry about coming up with strength on your own behalf. I'm going to be there with you to see you through and to help you make that witness, to testify. We know who has the last word. Difficult days come, they're inevitable. And though we may not be aware of it in the moment, God is among us, especially in those most difficult moments. The truth of the matter is, thinking back to the ambiguity of time, we don't know what the future holds. But we do know who holds the future. And we know who walks with us in our stumbling journey to that future. One of the most inspirational people I have ever known was Juanita, whom I knew back in Kentucky in the first parish I was serving after seminary. Juanita had a very difficult existence. She had been a single mom for decades, raised 2 children. In the decade before I got to that parish, Juanita had suffered 3 bouts of cancer. Each cancer a different cancer, and each cancer requiring surgery. And on top of that, I mentioned she was a single mom with 2 kids, perhaps. Each of her 2 children, in their own way, had caused and were causing Juanita intense and incredible grief and pain. Her son was actually in jail, and her daughter was suffering with substance abuse and living at home with Juanita in the midst of her disease. If I had been Juanita, I would probably have refused to have gotten out of the bed in the morning. I would have become embittered, resentful, at least, to put it mildly. That was not who Juanita was. Juanita literally never missed church. She was there every Sunday, and she was cheerful and welcoming to everybody. She was more or less the unofficial greeter Sunday after Sunday at this church. A beacon of welcome, a beacon of love, a beacon of peace that passes human understanding. 8 or 9 times at least during my tenure there in that parish, a member of the parish would be suffering some sort of difficult passage in their own life, and I would go up to the person and say, would you like to get together and talk and maybe process some of this? And they would inevitably say, oh, thank you, Tom, that's very nice of you, but I think I'll just go talk to Juanita. Juanita understood at a deep level the truth that Jesus is expressing in the gospel passage this morning. Tough times are ahead. Challenges and trials await. It's never easy for anyone, but always, forever, He's there. It doesn't depend on our own inner resources. It's all about trusting in His presence and His power of limitless love. So let's be honest. Just like those disciples looking up at that incredible building, stone stacked upon a stone. We do not know what tomorrow holds for us, but we do know who holds tomorrow and us in his hand.